Welcome to Syntax. Today we got a really exciting episode, big announcement about VS Code and GitHub Copilot. We got Erich Gamma and Kai Maetzel on, who are some of the early on. They've been working on VS Code for many years, and they're gonna talk to us all about it. So welcome Kai, welcome Erich. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, real quick, let's give a quick introduction before we hit the announcement. Just gives people some context of who you are within the VS Code project.
So I initiated when I joined Microsoft 15 years ago. I started the VS Code project. I was leading it for quite a while. More recently, I stepped down, became more an IC, individual contributor, and Kai is now running the show.
And I joined the VS Code project almost 10 years ago now.
Man. 10 years, wow. Yeah.
Is VS Code really 15 years old? What was the initial creation? Why did you start that project in the early days?
So we noticed there are kind of these new kind of developers that we often refer to as born-in-the-web developers. And we wanted to also give them tools so that we are relevant to them, right? We had a big tool, great Visual Studio, all integrated, one of the best. But we wanted to disrupt this a little bit and really attract born-in-the-web developers that don't like the all integrated one. They like command lines. They like to build their own tools, use many languages, whatever. That was the creation moment. And from that, it went on.
Oh, yeah. Well, it worked. You were just telling me a story about how, like I'm a web developer. I'm probably the target audience. I moved over from Sublime Text many years ago. Are you able to tell that story really quickly? Because I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, no, you were one of the Sublime evangelists eventually, right? And you saw that. I guess you wrote a book, had a theme about it. And you really talked about how can we convince the community with VS Code, right? And we saw you and we said, yeah, if you were able to convince Wes Boss to talk about VS Code, that's a good milestone, right? And then I guess you wrote the theme and you gave feedback. And so we somehow accomplished that. I still missed the book from you on VS Code.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been considering it. I maybe at some point there's quite a bit that a lot of tricks and whatnot that I have. I actually recently got off the Sublime Text key mapping, which I was on for 7 years. And now I feel like a baby again. I can't remember all of them.
I remember when VS Code first came out, it did seem like it caught fire immediately because, we had Atom, we had Sublime, we had all these editors. But it does feel like a substantial portion of the community moved right to VS Code. From your perspectives, was that how it felt internally as well?
We sometimes talk about that it's an overnight success, 10 years in the making, right? So we worked quite a bit before, right? So when we announced it, we worked for 5 years on it in a monthly rhythm, shipped every month. And we then gradually have grown, right? It wasn't a big bang, right? So... And it was always this growth approach, right? We have continually growth, and we are now at
40 million.
40 million. Yeah.
14 million users?
40.
40. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
That's nuts.
The growth rate, right? When you compare it to today's growth rates for some of the other tools, right? Then maybe it was not that big, right? But for the time, it was quite impressive, right? How we actually grew over time. And I remember, so the first million we hit, right? That was a big party. And then the second million we hit, that was a big party. And then, the third million, so the parties got a little bit smaller. And then I was like, okay, we double it again, and we double it. And so it's and then I was like, oh yeah, okay. Now we hit 40 million. That's
amazing.
I remember the 1 million cake. For 1 million, we had a cake, but I don't remember the other cakes.
That's true.
And if you want to see all of the errors in your application, you'll want to check out Sentry at sentry.io/syntax. You don't want a production application out there that, you have no visibility into in case something is blowing up and you might not even know it. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Again, we've been using this tool for a long time and it totally rules. All right.
One more thing, real quick. May 29th, Denver, Colorado. We're doing a syntax meetup. You got to be there if you're anywhere within a horse ride of Denver, Colorado. We got the folks from Vercel, the folks from Mux, folks from Sentry. We're all coming out. Of course, we're going to have Scott there. CJ's going to be there. I'm going to be there. It's going to be a really great time. If you want to grab some tickets, they're free, but you got to get tickets. Go to syntax.fm/meetup. VS Code, absolutely huge. In the last probably 4 years or so, Copilot, GitHub Copilot, absolutely huge. Sort of changing how we write code, and it's been a massive one. So the big announcement, lay it on us. What is it today?
Well, it's about open sourcing. VS Code is open source since 10 years. And we want to now open source the AI features from Copilot in VS Code. So it's about open source, which we talked about VS Code success before.
Yeah.
And open source is one of the reasons I think we got all this developer love, right? We try hard to be a good open source project. We try to be transparent, make PR submission easy, listen to feedback, and so on. And yeah, open sourcing is very important, dear to our heart. It's a way how we develop, and that's why this announcement is so exciting to me.
Incredible.
That's really exciting. So what that means is that like explain to us how Copilot and VS Code works right now, because it's like is it a plugin, or is it like was it a closed part of VS Code?
Kai, let me explain how it is, and then you explain the whole business story, because you initiated the whole thing and you can tell this very well, right? So today, it's an open core pattern we are using, right? VS Code is open source, of course. It has some AI enabling features in there which are open source, but it's open core. But the Copilot is a closed source extension, and there is a good reason why we started like that, and why there is an evolution.
And that's where I jump in.
Yes.
Exactly.
So yeah, when you think about the story as such, right? It started actually with GitHub Copilot, just completions, right?
Yeah.
And there at the time, we had really close working relationships actually with the folks at GitHub Next who did this in the beginning, right? Because it was about what should the UI look like, right? And this is when Ghost Text in a way came in, Ghost Text completions, right? Before we really just had suggest widgets, right? So and there it was in a way like a lot of the smarts were actually just in the extension. It was a fine-tuned 3.5 model, right? So there was a lot of craft actually in the prompt creation and all of these kinds of things, right? And Copilot was when I say Copilot in this case, the completions, right? They were really runaway success, right? You saw a lot of folks kind of seeing this and saying, "Oh, this is great, this is magical." There were still some who were kind of upset that it was not correct, right? And sometimes proposed something that was not quite spot on. But overall, I think it was a runaway success. And then the GPT-4, right? So ChatGPT announcement and GPT-4 came, right? And I think at this moment, everyone really, even the last person, started thinking about what are all the other things that you actually can do with AI, right? And what became relatively obvious was that I think the UI pieces of AI need to be really within the flow of what you actually do. So it really starts permeating all of this, right? But at the same point in time, it was still extremely hard to actually get reasonably functioning AI functionality, right? So there was still a lot of work that actually you had to put in the prompts, the pre-processing of the data in order to create the prompt, then actually post-processing, right? The models were really bad in actually answering in a format that you wanted them to answer. So there was a lot of code that you actually had to write in order to make that happen, right? Many different kinds of prompts for all different kinds of use cases and so on, right? So that was in a way the technical side, right? On the business side, I think you also have to think about no one really knew how to make a business out of this, right? Early on, it was like, oh, this is insanely expensive to run, right? So what do? We don't want to give anything away because no one really knows where the market goes and so on, right? So in the end, we ended up, as Erich said, in this kind of open core approach, which is that the UI elements, a whole bunch of the UI elements actually started more and more moving into core. We had to enable some of them through, for example, APIs, right? So we created more APIs and so on, and then parts were in the Copilot extension. When you then actually think about what really happened over the last few years, right? I mean, you just go, let's say you go to OpenAI and the OpenAI cookbook, right? Out of literally tells you, oh, here's the best ways of how you write your prompt in order to get, reliable answers. Anthropic, the same story, right? Google just had this 68-page PDF, right, for how to prompt and so on, right? Then you have something like Codex that OpenAI open sourced, right, where you literally can follow along how the whole prompt is created and all of these kinds of things. I think the landscape really massively shifted over the last year, maybe 2 years, right? In a way, how mature it is, how good the models actually became, even working with small little prompts, right? Prompting overall became much simpler, right? So, and if you take this all together, right, then, and now also better understanding of the business models, right, that what you really have to have on the servers, right, and that is pretty much your secret sauce, and what you have on the clients in a way became more and more of a way of, how should I say, not too much specific pieces in there that really differentiate you. And from that point of view, right, we think it's really a time, right, to put all of this in open source. Now you want to have people to be able to kind of go and say, oh, VS Code, I cloned it, right? Now I have cloned it. Now I built it. Now I launch it. Now I have code OSS, right? This is the out of source kind of version that you run, right? And with that, you can pretty much type something in the chat, right, and follow along, right? You can debug all the way how that actually makes it then finally to the server, right? And what the server actually responds, right? And then you can see how these things actually come. You can optimize for it, right? You can find problems. You can fix issues. You can create PRs if you want, right? So I think that's really the story, right? I think overall the same reasoning really applies to open source that applied to VS Code in the first place, right? Which is when you achieve a certain maturity of a market, right, then it makes sense to actually have a solution that is really open for all developers, right, where people can see what is happening behind the scenes, right, can participate, can have discussions with you about the features that you actually want to have, and so on, right, and then not just rely on us to actually do something about it, right, when there's a discussion, but can come and contribute, right? So in that, we strongly believe that this moment is here now. So that's why we made that call.
Interesting. So
maybe what I'd like to add, what I see also, for instance, now we have a competition like Cursor, and what they really show us, and what made me always jealous, right? When you are kind of an extension of VS Code, you are not really a little bit bolted on, right? But what you want to do with this move, you want to have the same thing, right? It's an AI editor. It's not just bolted on. It's really a core part. When you do code OSS, right? It's there. It's not that you have to install whatever, right? So it should just be this experience. And maybe also one thing, the whole prompting that Kai mentioned, it's in the extension right now, right? The whole prompting, how we do it and talk to the model, prompt construction, that's in the extension. And this thing right now, we also think we want to make this open source, get more eyes on it, right? Get contributions on it, and has security benefits and so on. And that's a good thing. It's also a very good thing for the developers. Sorry, then I like it. It's because for us as a developer, it's a little bit stressful to kind of straddle between open source and closed source, right? We do both, right? And we notice we talk differently open source to closed source. Open source we love to talk about and we get love. Closed source is different, right? Because it's not as friendly. People are more demanding because I don't know. It's just different. And for us as a developer team, it's always stress to play both hats, right? And for us, it's a relief to have this open source. consistently for the build process and for our thinking process.
Yeah. So part of Copilot, and probably a big part of it is figuring out what parts to send to the model. Correct me if I'm wrong, but like I was always curious about like, and we've had the folks from Windsurf on and whatnot, and we always ask them like what do you send? Like, are you looking at my clipboard? Are you looking at the open tabs? Like, how do you crawl for that perfect context and how all that works? So with Copilot being open source, we'll be able to see exactly what is being sent to the model and how those, and then also improve upon. Is that one of the big ideas here?
It's certainly one of them, right?
Yeah.
It changed a little bit, right? In the beginning, for example, you were absolutely right? The models didn't support reasonably tool calling, right? And from that point of view, you had to pretty much pack up everything up front, right, that you needed and send it to the model, right? But then there was also the needle in the haystack problem that when you sent too much, right,
Yeah.
the model kind of got confused and these kinds of things, right? We still do this for completions, right? That we pretty much pack all of the context up front and then let the model complete that, right? And there's still a lot of thinking going into it. What needs to be sent along? Like, for example, opening tabs. We compute some additional kind of context depending on if the language server actually supports that. You know, what types, for example, should be sent along in a stripped out way and so on, right? But then there are also other parts like that are very where that doesn't play so much into it anymore, like agentic flows, right? In agentic flows, you use something that we sometimes internally refer to as breadcrumb prompts, where you pretty much say, so there is a problem in the problems panel. There's output in the terminal. And so you really just say these things, and then you give the tool the model tools in order to retrieve this information when it thinks that it actually needs that information.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Okay.
And that is a much simpler approach actually, right? And sometimes you have to help a little bit along with the right prompting approach to say what kind of aspects to prioritize in its considerations and so on. But overall, right, that tool calling made that much simpler. Right?
Interesting.
No, when you say prioritization, Kai, what we also have infrastructure, right? We use kind of TSX to describe prompts. It's not just string concatenation. And this gives us flexibility, right? That we can say the nodes in a tree have a priority and we can add more or less depending on the context window.
Yeah, this is how we render prompts, right? What I was saying is more like in the prompt itself, you tell the tool that, or you tell the model what tools first to look at, right? For example, check, if there is some problem in the problems panel, do this first, right? Don't look, for example, in the output of the terminal or something along those lines, right? So you give it some guidance how to proceed through the context. What Erich is referring to is, well, of course, right, we still have limited context windows, right? And there's a real trade-off here, right? You have context windows that are either technically constrained by the model, right? Or you actually want to constrain it so that you get a certain throughput. So the rule of thumb clearly is with the smallest possible prompt that you can send, you want to have the best possible outcome, right? And so if you pump the full context window, right, then the real question is, and you get a certain outcome, how small can you make it in order to get the same outcome, assuming that the outcome actually is good, right? And so that is then where pretty much our whole prompt rendering story comes in, right? What are parts in the prompt that you can drop at which points in time, right? Once you hit the context windows, once you hit a certain size for a certain portion, like think about history, right? You don't want to just pump history into the context window until the context window is full, right? So what's a natural way of capping this, right? At which point did the conversation flip, for example, to be about something else, and this is not relevant anymore, right? So these kinds of things.
And does that include logic for different types of programming languages, or is that left up to the model? Like, does the Copilot extension have logic for how to treat TypeScript and JavaScript versus like Java?
So actually the prompts are not too specific. So there's a history here.
Okay.
And the history is in the early days, absolutely, right? We had an approach that we called, for example, cookbooks, right? Where we're saying, oh, different languages, different language tools have, for example, different linters have different errors and different error messages and so on, right? And then we created these kinds of cookbooks by saying, oh, if you're in a Python file and you use pylint and you see the particular kind of errors, here are ways of how you can fix it and, what this really means and how you can fix it. And that was quite language specific, right? Sometimes you had to give also hints about syntax and so on. Right? Not funnily, right? Just what I said before, on a maturation curve, these kinds of things are way less necessary these days. What we still do, clearly, language specific, is what we talked about, completions context, right? Because that's clearly language specific, right? What if a language supports type, let's say interfaces, right? Yeah, then you need to write some code in order to find the right interfaces that you want to include, and so on, right?
I think also what is kind of semantic but not language specific is when it comes to workspace knowledge, right? So the whole thing, how you find the relevant snippet to add to a prompt, that has a very sophisticated indexing infrastructure that is based on tree database, AST know-how of ranges and so on, and then computing embeddings. But that's done at the level of grammars, right? It's not very,
This is all just so exciting to me, but I often I'm like wondering about. I know we're getting into some different things here, but I was more curious about the implications of what this would mean for paid Copilot features within VS Code.
So now, first of all, Copilot today has a free option, right? So you just can sign up and you're on free, right? There are some limits associated with this, right? How many premium requests you can get, right, to premium models. There's a base model that we actually have in Copilot, right, where you can continue, right? There are no limits on those calls and so on. With free, you can also bring your own key, right? So you put it in, whatever API key you already have and you pay for it, right? You can actually use. So will Copilot is there a relationship between you paying for really advanced Copilot functionality and open source? No, not really, right? Because the point is, still someone has to pay for the compute,
right?
To run the LLMs and all of this, right? And that is really unrelated from the open source question, right? So open source means that you can follow along everything that happens on the client, and you can see what we send to the servers, right? And what you pay for then in the end, assuming that you pay and you're not on free, right, is pretty much the compute on the back end.
Okay.
Right? And like for enterprises, some additional service like indemnification and these kinds of things. Right?
And the key thing to keep in mind, right? Bring your own key. This is the infrastructure where you can bring your API key, and then we go to your model directly without going through the GitHub backend service, right? To get the completion. And that's, I think, is a nice complement that we already have for this story, right?
Yeah. And is there any like secret sauce that you put on the server side of Copilot? And if so, because I was chatting with Burke on our live stream a couple of weeks ago, and he's like, bring your own key. Most of that you can run through, like if you want to bring your own key, you can run it straight to the OpenAI model or Anthropic model or Google model, whatever. Mm-hmm. But he also said there is a fine-tuned model. Is that true? That are for some parts of Copilot?
Yeah. There's not just one. There are several. Think about it this way. Yes, you can bring your own key. There are additional services that Copilot, so the GitHub Copilot service gives us, right? And Erich made a reference to one of them, like finding relevant source code snippets. So what happens, right, is GitHub, when I say GitHub, right, the team on the GitHub side is actually indexing all of those repositories that are all open source repositories. You can opt in for your private repositories to be indexed and so on, right? But what indexing really means, I'm pretty sure you've heard that before, is the code pretty much gets chunked, and then embeddings are computed for each of those chunks.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then when we look for relevant code, for example, what happens is we take that query that the user types in, right? And then we compute the embeddings for that query. And then we pretty much go and find embeddings that are relatively close to this in the repository, right? And that, for example, is functionality that GitHub provides us, right? Is that secret sauce? Well, there's some clever things that are being done, right? But it's not. I wouldn't call it. I wouldn't call it secret sauce, but it's clearly about scalability of all of this. Think about this. There, I don't know what the latest numbers, but something like 500 million repositories on GitHub and so on, right? So there's a massive scaling infrastructure behind that, right? Then there are some other use cases where, for example, new models are really good in editing files, for example, right? So Sonnet has the replace string, right? So you can search for a certain string, right? Find it and then replace it with something else. And the model is very reliable in giving you this. The new 4.1 models that OpenAI is, they give you something like, it's called apply patch, right? So they really give you this kind of diff patch format to some, right? And they're also very good in doing this. So, but there's a lot of other cases where models actually are not good in doing something like this. Right, and there's another technique where you just go and tell the model, hey, pretty much give me a rewrite of the file and elide all of the code that is pretty much the same of stuff that has not changed, just say, here's existing code, right? And then you pretty much give the original file plus that kind of rewritten file with the elided spaces. You give this to a model and now fiddle it all together so that a reasonable outcome comes out, right? And that, for example, is a custom model that does that, right?
Okay.
And we do that many times a day, right? So that needs to be cheap to run and so on. And when you want to run it cheap, right, then you need to have custom models the smallest possible model that does a really good job at it, right? So that's, for example, and then the completions models are clearly custom, right? Then next edit suggestion, right? That is the tap kind of functionality, right? You at some particular page, you made a change. Here are all the subsequent changes that you should make in order to make it consistent again, right? That is a custom model.
Okay.
Right? I think this is what you will see more and more, right? What really happens is you can take one big model, right? And the big model is really smart at doing things, but it's also really expensive at doing things, and it's slow at doing things, right? And what you want is you want to make it for the user fast, and for you, as you want to put little load on your service infrastructure. Right? So you've got to then pretty much distill, right, in multiple steps until you have the smallest possible model for given use cases, right?
Okay.
And it will vary over time how many of those custom models you have, right? Can you achieve the same by just, as I said before, to talk to a big model? Yep, right? But then again, quite expensive and slow.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, you're running that. Like I often think about that. I'm coding for 10 hours a day, and it's running every single, I don't know how often, but like keystrokes, right?
Yeah, right.
And I
repeatedly.
often think like, how are they making money on this? It's got to be expensive to run this, yeah.
May I want to say one point, since you talk about all these backend model and services, right? For the open source announcement, right? So the backend services, they will not be open sourced, right?
That's right.
Okay,
But of course, the
good to know.
whole VS Code, all the how we render diffs that get streamed in from the model, how we do inline chat, how we do kind of the agent UI and so on. All that is open sourced, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I do wonder about the UI bit of it, because we've seen kind of the rise of the VS Code fork and experimenting in different UIs for these types of things. How much do those design choices modify your thinking in terms of what the VS Code's interface and how it should relate to working with AI? Or do you have your own experiments? I mean, I'm sure you do, but is everything that comes out into VS Code informed by your own experiences, or is there influence coming in from others in the space working in these types of UIs?
Well, clearly it's informed by others. as well, right? I mean, even today, issues for Copilot, for example, are open, right? There's the VS Code Copilot release repository where you can look at issues. People make feature proposals there. In the VS Code core repo, right? Many issues actually land directly in the open source VS Code repo. Like we're saying, oh, I do this, right? And you have this button here, but I really like to have this button over here because there are two others who put the button over there. Right?
Yeah.
So from that point of view, clearly, right, their influence comes also from others. But I wouldn't say that this isn't this is just like tool development always happened, right? You take good inspiration from others, right? You would be stupid not to do so. But at the same point in time, you need good scrutiny in what you actually really do and what you don't do, because you need to maintain your identity. You need to think about the users that are already there, the UI patterns they already do understand. Then also a big difference for us is like our extensibility story. So like, for example, we always need to think about something like, oh, if we put a button here, who else wants to put the button here? And then in the end, you have 15 buttons, and then, right, that doesn't work. So how do we make UI scalable, keep it still lean and clean, don't lose our own design language by still picking smart ideas that other folks had, right? So I think in AI, exactly the same rules apply that always applied to tool development, right?
So actually, that's a concern that I have, right? So we see these forks, right? And I sometimes see they miss a little bit the spirit of VS Code, right? The blue button for AI everywhere, right? And it prompts you whatever. Of course, you can do that, but we have a platform mindset, right? We want to be good for many others. You cannot be monopolistic and say now everything is like that. And that also the other thing I sometimes miss when I look at what the folks are doing, kind of the consistency we have, right, in VS Code, and that's one of the concerns I have with the forks. Maybe an example, right? Cursor, they have changed the UI, totally unrelated, that they have the activity bar on top, right? Which I think is a great UI idea, right? Why not, right? In the meantime, we have added this option as well. I have a hard time to understand why didn't they contribute it back, right? Because it's a US thing. So I don't understand it. Because in particular, when we did it, and what we noticed, the implementation they give to the user is not complete, right? So we get badges where you see how many changes you have for the Git view, right? And they don't do that. So that hurts me, right? This loss of consistency we have kind of established and we care about when we do a feature. Because sometimes the forks, they optimize where they want to go and forget about the platform. And that's to me the whole long-term view we have. We want to be built to last for a long time and not for just one wave.
Makes sense. And I want to talk a little bit about like the business decision. I know you guys are engineers and whatnot, but if you're comfortable talking about that, like what does open sourcing GitHub Copilot mean for Cursor and Windsurf? Like they forked the editor, so you're saying have the rest as well? You know, what is it? What happens there?
What do you mean by have the rest? Sorry.
Like, so they fork VS Code and then add their own AI stuff on top of it. And now you're saying, well, here's our AI stuff as well. You can have that as well. Like anybody can have that. Anybody can build upon this as well. Is there like a strategic business reason that Microsoft is doing this?
Maybe one thing is what we heard from some organizations. They really don't like closed source IDEs. So by making the other pieces open source, I think we address that need, right? And but that's more for these bigger organizations. And of course, then they have a choice between closed source and open source. Yeah.
You put the disclaimer up front, right? We're engineers on the project.
Yeah.
So a pure business person might actually answer that somewhat differently.
Yeah.
Right? But when I think about this, the part is really, could they take whatever we have, right? The whole thing. Could someone take the whole thing, put a new batch on it, and say this is now ours and mark it under their name. Sure, right? But we also know how pretty much the open source community has reacted for many years when someone tried to do this with VS Code proper, right? There was always immediately this question, why would you do this? Why would you not bring the changes back to VS Code? Why would you not work in favor of the overall developer ecosystem, right? I think the competition, at least that's my point of view, right? Will move more and more to the services that you actually provide around this and really what's running on the backends and all of these kinds of things, right? Right now, for example, we have, and I'm purely speculating here, of course, right? But right now we have access all to the best frontier models, right? So OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, all of them give the models out, right? But you could also imagine a world where that is not the case, right? Where people actually try to create very, very specific models and keep certain kinds of secret model source just to themselves and to their own AI tools and so on, right? So I think, again, as it was in many other cases, right, what really matters, right, is on the servers, how that is done. This is right how you scale, how you provide in the end lasting value to your customers, right? And what happens on the client, those things you want to trust, you want to see what is happening there. If you're a big enterprise, you want to see and pretty much audit those things, right? And make sure everything is good, right? Like we have discussions, right, with enterprises that come and say, yeah, so what do you put in your prompt? What really is this, right? And like you, Wes, right, you ask, so what's the context you put in there? And people are like, whoa, we're really suspicious about what you put in here and all of this, right? I was like, yeah, have a look now, right? Go, you look, right? So it's all there. You can do it, right? You can see it. So I cannot really tell you what it does to Cursor's business, but it's also their business, not mine. So, but I can like think about that or what I just mentioned, right? I think it moves to the server. That's where real competition happens, right? And what we do on the clients, again, right? It also informed our decision. I mentioned that earlier, right? Like the prompt crafting, all of these kinds of things, right? They're like more understood, right?
We also know there is kind of some convergence, right?
That's right.
As Kai said, the secret sauce is on the server, all these custom models. On the UI side, there is kind of more convergence, right? Inline chat, how you do that, how you show the diff stream, get streamed in. And this was actually, I just want to, when you talk to these forks, why they fork, one of the reasons they say, well, the VS Code API was not powerful enough to enable the AI innovation they wanted, right?
Yeah.
And that's correct. We don't allow you to do kind of big UI in using our API. That's totally intentional, right? Because we care about stability and performance. For instance, you could not do a code completion UI using our extension API, right? That's just not how it is. And this has, of course, a little bit this tension, right? You want to kind of change deep in the core. But of course, we don't allow that because you want stability and evolution. But by now, I think things have converged and evolved. So I find it a missed opportunity that there was no collaboration on that, right? Because we're a small team, the other forks are small teams, and I think both talented people. So we could have done maybe something even better for the whole thing because the whole value is in the backend in the end.
Yeah, in that regard, was it a surprise when these forks started popping up, or was it something you all had anticipated?
That was a surprise, right? And it's, of course, a fork for an open source steward like KindIR is not a pleasant experience, right? And when you see about, and of course you want to understand why, and of course one is the API thing, yeah. But I must one say one thing, even though the API is not really made for deep UI innovations, what we see is the community innovate a lot on top of our existing APIs, right? We see some nice AI editors, extensions also. So this always blows me away how much creativity our community has to do innovation on top of our UI. But it's totally true. Deep innovation below it is challenges. Yeah, this was one reason. The other thing, of course, this what always made me jealous about them, this don't have AI bolted on, they have it built in, right? And this is what a fork allowed them to do, which what we didn't have, because we had to restructure our code that all the AI stuff is in this closed source extension, right? And to me and for the developer team, it's a big relief now when we no longer have to do this kind of indirection. We can also go to a really AI first mindset.
And that means that like other extensions can now like use the AI features as part of their feature set. You know, if you're making a totally unrelated to Copilot extension for something like a database tool, is there APIs or will there be APIs that, like, let's say that database tool add-on could then use AI APIs?
Yeah, there's actually a couple of things here. The first one is we actually made that available before, right? So there is, for example, in the VS Code API namespace, right? There is an LLM namespace. So you can create, for example, chat participants, and then those actually can participate in a normal chat conversation, right? Mm-hmm. The tools, for example, that models can call, right? Those tools are already public APIs. So extensions can contribute tools, MCP servers can contribute tools, MCP, right? Yeah. There is a way you can just, as an extension, just read all of the tools that are available. You can craft your prompt, send it through the model, through our APIs. That is actually stuff that already exists today. Okay. Right. And there are also, there's a good ecosystem around this, right? When you look at Klein, for example, right, they use some of that API, right? In their dropdown, they can say, yeah, use the models that you get through Copilot, right? But they also do some other custom pieces, right? But will there be more APIs going forward? Probably. Do we know right now what they will look like? No, not quite yet.
Mm-hmm. But the mindset, right? It's still like in VS Code. In VS Code, you can contribute by writing an extension, which is the extension API. You can contribute by making a pull request if you want to find an issue or find a problem, want to improve in AI a prompt or so. So this is kind of the same thing. What we now give to this open sourcing, we give kind of the community two things, right? Source code access. So if they have a problem with their extension, they can go to the source and look deeper. That's one thing. And we give them the tool to make pull requests, right? Which is really make code extension. That's the thing, how to think about it, right? It's not that we already have extension APIs, as Kai said, and a very important one, right? How we can contribute new tools to the agentic flow. And that's already there. And this will continue to be there. But what we see from VS Code, developers love to have source access when they do extension authoring. Well, at least me, I do that. Right?
Mm-hmm. Totally. I agree. I'm excited about it because, I don't know, a couple of years ago, there was a bug in Copilot where it was adding like an extra curly bracket at the end of all the tabs. And I was losing my mind over it. And I was like, if we just had access to this thing, and I couldn't even fathom like how it was working or what was going on or how edits get applied. That's all like a kind of black box to me. So I'm very curious now to actually dive into the code and see how that stuff works.
Maybe we should say, right? We announced that we will make it open source, but there is work ahead of us because it's different, right? When we open sourced VS Code, we were totally closed source. And then when we are ready, we threw the switch. Right now, what happens is we already have an open source core. And now we have to tune it, refactor it to make it open to these AI features. This means the community will see we make changes in the core and they will ask questions, right? What's going on? You will be surprised. No, they watch every commit, right? And of course, we can do fake commit messages, improve the naming when we really do kind of an improved app, right? So we have work ahead of us to do. So today we have an announcement, we'll do that and we're excited about it, but we have work ahead of us. And I don't know, Kai, whether you want to, since you drive the whole thing, whether you want to say timeline things. But for me, we have big problems, right, that we have to solve. And I'm not a fan of timelines, but Kai, if you want, you can.
Software engineers are famously great at giving timelines, so let's have it.
Yeah, let me put it this way: Erich is right. There is a work ahead of us. There are a couple of things to consider when you open source something, right? So there's a legal aspect to this, right? And that you have the right copyrights everywhere, that, that you make sure that this is all properly done, that you don't have internal references to internal issues and these kinds of things in your source code, right? All these kinds of things that are kind of obvious, right? And then there are other considerations about code quality, right? Developers, there's no secret here. If no one's watching, maybe your code is not exactly the same quality of if the world is watching, right? So there, people might be concerned about this, right? But we'll make a point here saying code quality is not an aspect that we care at this moment, right? When we make this open source, but there are other bigger things like, what do we do with the internal issues we already have? What do we do with like, for example, we invented this whole mechanism of what we call S-tests. Think about it as unit tests that can deal with the stochastic behavior of models, right? So you don't run the test just once, you run it several times, right? You cache responses from LLM, and so there's very interesting what we did there.
That's cool.
But now there's a lot of
Emma. So as a person who worked on unit testing, right? So the big problem is when you have in a test anything with LLM, then the test becomes stochastic. And testing, the worst thing in unit testing is flaky tests, right?
Yes.
You hate flaky tests, right? But as soon as you have an LLM in there, your test is by definition flaky, right? And that's what we try to address with what Kai explained, the simulation test, right? Which is pretty cool technology, but also that will require work to package and make available and think about that.
Right?
Oh,
Make
wow.
available then the actual test cases, right? So how do we get good test cases, right? That is usually from internal kind of flights, right? Where we can actually look at the concrete prompt that was being sent, right? With the concrete source snippets and so on, right? I'm saying, oh, in these particular cases it failed, right? Then we added it, for example, to our S-test suite, right? Now we've got to clean this all out, right? We cannot make these things available publicly. So there's real work to be done, right? So we'll start pretty much today, right? With the announcement that work is starting, right? And then we'll make sure step by step, right? That we go. I think our main point here is we make the announcement, we don't throw it over the fence, right? That's not how we work, but we will provide transparency in every single step that we take here. Right, so do you know exactly what to expect, right? And you know all of our iterations plans are public, right? They are even pinned on the issues, right, for every single month. And GitHub repo, there will be entries in there. You can follow along. You can ask questions, right? That's how we operate. So we will make sure that there's a fully transparent process. Will you see everything right now? No. I just mentioned why there's things that we need to do first, right?
That's cool. That S-test stuff that's really neat. I know that there are some other like just generic AI tests that help you answer the question of, is this getting worse? You know, because you always hear that from people being like, oh, the AI is not as good anymore. They turned some knobs down. And you often wonder, like, is that just my perception of it? Am I expecting more, or is it actually doing it? And this like non-deterministic output of AI is kind of hard to do. So that's really interesting to see that you have some sort of testing against the AI output.
Yeah, the life is no longer red-green, right? The life is percentages, and you have also a baseline. As you said, right? It's very important you compare against the baseline because you don't have a red-green anymore. And that's what the S-test infrastructure tries to do. And it uses, of course, cloud infrastructure for doing that, which is another to-do item, how we make that.
I do have to ask, just like switching things, because you're in this AI space, obviously. Do you have any opinions on like what future of software engineering looks like with AI? Are we out of a job, or like what are your personal opinions and thoughts there?
Oh, if you only would knew, huh? No. I had this conversation just the other day with someone, and I made a statement there where independent of what it will look concretely, I think you will not have just people who are just at one particular level of abstraction, right? Really deep, just do, right? I don't know, optimization for one particular aspect. Maybe a few of them will survive, right? But you could make a good living as a developer by being quite specialized, right? And I don't know if this will remain true, right? What I believe is that as a developer, you need to be, or what a developer will be in the future, or creator, maybe we should just call them creators, right? Will be going across many different levels of abstraction in pretty much speed of light, right? So you think about a product idea, you scaffold something out, you run it, it fails a little bit, so you went all the way down, right, just to fix a tiny little issue. Then you go up again and think about your customer, right, and think about changes and think about design. You go down again, right? And this, I think this flexibility, right, the thinking about your users, I think developers will become a little bit more entrepreneurial in their whole way of how they think about this, holistic, how they have to approach a problem, right? And I think that's where that, I would guess where that really goes, right? Where you live on all of those levels of abstractions very, very quickly. And today you could make a comfortable life to kind of just sit here and never go down, or just be a PM and sit up here and never really, go down.
Yeah.
Go down. So it's like, I think that will go away, right? I
Interesting.
think the most powerful people will be those that can think in all of these levels of abstractions pretty much fluently, going up and down.
Yeah, you're not the first person that said that to me.
So what's definitely true for me is there will be more creators, right? Given all that, I think there will be more creators, but I also think if I look, I like to exploit by looking back and looking forward, right? It's incremental, right? First we got ghost text, then we got chat, then we got snippets. Now we got then multiple file edit, then we got agents. Now it is an evolution, right? It's not that all of a sudden this is changing. I think that's why I'm not too nervous, because we can follow along.
Yeah, it is interesting. Even like, I mean, we've noticed Wes and I are both kind of tinkerers and creators, and it's enabled me to get into, CAD modeling and all kinds of stuff. Wes was hacking his Roomba with it.
C++ microcontroller for the first time in my life, and then like on the flip side as well, like you get a little higher into the 3D space and trying to figure out what customers want, like you said. So you're not the first person that I've talked to that said that. Like you both go both deeper and higher. All right, we got 5 minutes left. Is there anything we didn't touch upon that you would like to get across? What's your favorite model to use? I'm curious.
Oh, that's a loaded question.
Yes.
No, it's not loaded. It's relatively straightforward, right? Because and that is clearly a point of time, right? Statement. Mm-hmm. It's always a point of time statement with all of those models, right?
Yeah.
Right now, Sonnet is just nicer to use, right? Because it's more predictable in the output that it generates. It's more tracking, particularly in agent flows, more tracking, on a particular task. And it also creates code that is nicer, right? And what I mean by this one is I look at the code that Sonnet proposes and I like it better than the code that some other models propose, right? I personally didn't have that much exposure yet to Gemini 2.5 Pro, right? Mm-hmm. I hear really, really good things about it. So the few experiments I personally ran looked kind of good, right? But yeah, then there are way more aspects to it, right? So like, for example, speed, right? So do I like a model that is not as great, but it's much, much faster? Yeah, it depends on the delta, but I like fast, right? So it really is, it's quite a fluid field, right? And and what I really like is the competition, right? What I like to see is that new Sonnet model is here, and everyone like new Sonnet model, and OpenAI comes back and says, "Oh, here's our new model. Try this one. This is awesome." So then it kind of goes back and forth, right? So
Yeah, everything gets better, faster, and cheaper, which is good for us.
And you get more choices, right? Bring your own key. You can select a model and switch easy, right? Things become multi-model, right? That's what I
Mhm.
really think is such a great accomplishment recently.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because we're talking open source, right? What is really nice, and now when I talked about the models, right? I really just took the closed weight ones, right? But what is really beautiful, and I think will be way more important going forward, right, is pretty much open source or open weight models, right? And you've seen what DeepSeek had done and what kind of stir that actually created in the community
Yeah.
and so on, right? And now think about it, right? You have VS Code as an OpenAI editor, and you have open weight models. And that's really a combination that's quite powerful, right?
Yeah. Wow, man, this is just so exciting overall, and thank you both for coming on and sharing all this with us. I think people are going to be very excited about this news in general. Just as you mentioned earlier,
VS Code,
yeah.
man.
Oh yeah,
Like,
thank you
I
for
honestly
VS
think
Code.
like
Yeah,
VS Code is probably, if I were to like look at my entire career, like VS Code and TypeScript are probably the two most important pieces of software in my career, which is absolutely massive. So like I thank you for putting it out in the world. I think it's made software in the world a much better place in general. I know that people in tech tend to say that, but man, it's been huge.
Yeah, and I mean, we started with this, right? Thank you for helping us making VS Code great, right? I remember the one feature that we just built for you.
Yeah.
What was it?
Oh, that I think because I forgot where it came from, maybe from a tweet or something. Eric might remember. It was like, oh, when I present in my courses and so on talk, then people cannot see my cursor, so I need a little bit of a wider cursor.
Oh
And so we
yeah.
made an
Oh.
option to make the cursor wider, and that was
Oh
literally
yes.
just for you.
I love
That
it.
was just for
Yeah,
you.
I was. I appreciate that. I was like, I think I was hacking it with CSS at the time because like my students needed to see where I was with the cursor. So I just made a huge, big, blocky one and threw it in there. So I
Yep, and
appreciate
then we
that.
gave you a
Me,
setting for it.
man, we were tracking you on Twitter, right? We were following you, and as you said, once you had something you don't like, we jumped on it. We want to make you a
Amazing.
happy customer, right?
Yeah.
All right.
That's
Well,
right.
let's like while I have you,
Yeah, what else you got? Yeah.
What else do I want on this type of thing?
Now
No,
you're
it's
convert. Now you're convert, right? So
Yeah.
yes, yeah. Now you don't have to worry about me. That's great. Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate all your time. Really excited about this, and hope to talk to you again sometime.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having us.
thank you. Bye bye.